The coronavirus storm is far fiercer and much more destructive than any that we have known before. It is stretching our resources as we speak, but it is also stretching our resolve to their very limits. The surge of infections that our experts and scientists predicted over 3 months ago has now arrived. The National Coronavirus Command Council and Cabinet have considered whether we should return all or parts of the country to a higher alert level, either to level 4 or to level 5. The advice, however, we've received is that taking this step now would not necessarily achieve a significant reduction in the rate of transmission.
Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. We are coming to you live on SABC 3 as well as the SABC News channel. I'm Aldrin St-Pierre. Before we get into today's conversation, let's take a moment to remember Zinzi Mandela, the ambassador to Denmark, the daughter of the late former President Nelson Mandela and the late former struggle stalwart Winnie Madikizela Mandela, who passed away this morning. At the time of her death, Zinzi was the South African ambassador to Denmark, also earmarked to be reposted to Liberia. Now on to this evening's conversation. It's almost been 4 months since the announcement of the lockdown aimed at mitigating the impact of COVID-19, but the well-intended move has inadvertently created a breeding ground for corruption and malfeasance. Billions of rands have been channeled towards the pandemic relief efforts, but most of it landed in the hands of opportunists waiting to make a quick buck on the back of the devastating pandemic. The Special Investigating Unit is currently about to start an inquiry into allegations of fraud and corruption around the COVID-19 tenders. There are questions around whether the 500 billion rand relief grant, which the President has announced in April, is serving its intended purpose. Tonight, we'd like to engage political parties as we ask you, how has COVID-19 corruption affected you? Remember that you can join the discussion on our social media platforms using the hashtag SABC News Online, and you can also use the hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. We'll start off the conversation by speaking to Keza Khenyaga, who's the spokesperson for the Special Investigating Unit. So as soon as we get a hold of him, he'll be joining us. We'll also have Kavisha Pillay, who is the head of the Legal and Investigations at Corruption Watch. We'll also be joined by DA spokesperson Soli Malatsi, Sinawa Tambo, who is the EFF head of the presidency, as well as ANC spokesman Pule Mabe. But first, let's start here. Okay, let's quickly see if we have Pule Mabe on the line. Good evening, Pule, and welcome. Okay, let's play these clips first before we introduce our guest.
For this is not a time for politicking, but a time of coming together as a country united in its commitment to pushing back on the deadly frontiers of this virus. What we have seen over the past couple of months in certain instances has been quite disturbing, where politicking and politics has characterized some of the work of government and political parties themselves.
South Africans did give government efficient time to get the healthcare system ready to deal with this pandemic. But still, 3 months later, our healthcare system is inadequate. And what's the reasons for that? For 26 years, the ANC government did not prioritize the healthcare system, and because of mismanagement, the healthcare system has collapsed.
Very much concerned about some of the decisions that the National Command Council is taking. In the past, it was decisions based on the advice of some scientists and experts, and not political decisions.
It was clear that those were from the overseas countries were the ones bringing this illness inside the country. The borders should have been closed earlier and the international flights suspended earlier on. We should have avoided even the number that we have currently.
Okay, let's to a quick ad break. When we come back, we'll be in conversation with various political parties, including the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, and the EFF. And welcome back. A sincere apologies for those glitches that we experienced early on. But we now do have Keza Kganyago on the line, the spokesperson of the Special Investigating Unit. Baba Kganyago, good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. Let's start off here in terms of the conversation that has had between the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development around the proclamation that is yet to be declared by the President.
Good evening, Alden and your viewers. The discussion that is happening is going very well. We had a lot of discussions around this national COVID-19 proclamation. At the moment, we are engaging with the legal division of the Department of Justice, who will then, after that, finalize that proclamation that we submitted to them and give it to the minister for his concurrence and then to the president for a signature. That's where the process is at the moment.
So let's just quickly take a few steps back. How did the SIU get involved here?
We were getting, obviously, a lot of people who were giving us allegations from different angles. I might remind people that we started at the beginning of the lockdown with that 30 million rand tender that was done with the e-governance in Gauteng. Mm-hmm. And we investigated that because that one was the second one. We investigated it, and then we gave the report because we were requested by the Premier. We gave the report back to the Premier. Then there was an issue of the fence in that was happening there in Limpopo. And then we started getting allegations about food parcels, allegations from the Gauteng Health Department about PPEs that were not bought properly. And when these allegations started to be many, we thought instead of having a proclamation for each and every one, as we are supposed to do, we would rather than go and have one proclamation that will look at all the COVID-19 related allegations, including the relief funds that were put aside.
From the allegations that you received from the whistleblowers, I'd imagine, do you have any idea what the quantum of these allegations are in terms of the money?
At the moment, it is not, unless it is a tender, we are not able to say this is the quantum. But for an example, if it is a tender like the one in Gauteng, we know it was 30 million rand. Yeah. Like the fence that in Bay Bridge, we know it was 37 million rand. But if you then come and say food parcels were not delivered, whatever, we cannot quantify that. But that is why we then said, let us look at everything, including the relief funds that have been put aside by government, because they are there to deal with issues of COVID, and that is the 500 billion that we were talking about, inclusive. Therefore, we check each and everything that has happened and all the allegations so that they can be put into one and investigate them once, and we give one report, which will be our relief fund during the COVID-19 era.
So with the discussion that's currently underway, and all of this is happening while we're still going through COVID-19, and the government is still disbursing funds to various government entities, does this mean that once this declaration comes, this declaration will be open-ended to allow for any other allegation relating to COVID-19 funds being investigated?
I don't want to use the word open-ended, but I'm saying it will help us to really investigate real time. Because now, when we get an allegation, we then have to test whether there is meat in the hole or whatever, and allegation, and then we go through the route of a proclamation, and then only after a while we are able to get the proclamation and start investigating. Mm-hmm. But if we have a proclamation that deals with all of those things, when an allegation comes, we will just test whether there's something to investigate and go into it real time. And that way, we'll be able to, in most of the instances, stop the processes even before the monies are paid. Yep. Like in a case of the Gauteng tender that was there. By the time we got in, no money was paid as yet. Mm-hmm. If we were able to deal with that, rather than wait for the money to be paid and then be in a position to then follow up the money after, which becomes a longer process.
Do you have any idea how long such an investigation would take, or would this all depend on how soon the Department of Constitutional Development and Justice is able to finalize their work?
We got confirmation that the process will be speeded up and make sure that all the things are done. Because what is important is we want to make sure that whatever we do is within the law. Because if it is not within the law, people might then take us to court even when they have done things that are wrong. Therefore, we're trying to do that. We don't want to rush it and then put ourselves in a difficult position. But then once that is signed, we will be able to deal with the cases as and when they come and finalize them as speedily as possible, because it is important that we then give back the confidence to the people of South Africa that nobody will benefit from the grief of the people of South Africa.
Okay, and do you know of any party, sorry, not any party, but rather any department, government department that is facing allegations of corruption and that have come to you and, of course, that would be part of this particular process?
We obviously, at the moment, we have the Department of Health in Gauteng. We have got, with the PPEs, we have got now a message that the OR Tambo municipality, you remember that door-to-door campaign? We had that the Premier, that side, has written to the President that it be brought to our side for investigation. We have got some municipalities in the Western Cape that have approached us. We have got allegations from Corruption Watch that are coming our way in relation to food parcels, and we have got Department of Public Works and Infrastructure in relation to the Bait Breach and many other allegations that are coming our way.
Okay, then, thank you so much. That is Keza Kganyago, the spokesperson of the Special Investigating Unit. So when we come back, we'll be hearing from the various political parties about all of these allegations of corruption that they have heard. We'll also be speaking a little bit later on, as you just heard, Tate Keza Kganyago, touching on the Corruption Watch and the allegations that they've brought to the SIU. So I'll be speaking to them just after this. And welcome back. Let's bring into the conversation the spokesperson of the ANC, Pule Mabe. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. Listening into what Keza Kganyago had to say about these allegations of corruption, just the first take from the ANC side. How do you feel that there are these allegations of corruption during such a time of a health crisis?
Well, thanks, Aldrin, and thanks to technical guys are writing, so we can't really hear you. But it is quite concerning, and perhaps also encouraging on the side of the SIU, the fact that they have now gone ahead to request for a much wider proclamation that would be able to look into how funds meant for COVID-19 shall have been dispensed. It is concerning on the front that monies or interventions meant to deal with the plight of our people on the ground might in some way end up fulfilling what they were not meant for. So it is good that you have institutions of state beginning to do this kind of a proactive investigation, so that where there are lapses of governance systems, such could be unearthed much early in the day, and then the necessary intervention mechanisms are then put in place to make sure that we could cap potential leakages.
Yeah.
This actually demonstrates a desire on our government to drive forward a capable ethical state, a commitment that we made in our manifesto when we went to elections last year.
Okay. Has the ANC's Integrity Commission or committee received any allegations leveled against some of its members?
Well, where there were allegations, not necessarily that they will have to go to the Integrity Commission, where the allegations of our own members doing things that give the ANC a bad name in that way, and it becomes a disciplinary matter, actions have been taken. I can remind you, Aldrin, and the viewers of SABC, of the actions that our own ANC Provincial Executive Committee in Mpumalanga had to take against a councillor who shall have been accused when we were just early on, when we were starting with a lockdown, to have been selling permits for foreign nationals. I'm sure that is the case now that is being attended by the police. When we concluded our last National Executive Committee meeting of the ANC, we issued a statement in there, commended the over 4,000 councillors that are deployed to various wards, acting as MMCs and mayors, who are doing a great job, but also went on to isolate the about 14 councillors of the ANC that shall have been found to be in the wrong as it relates to the distribution of food parcels. And we must thank members of the community who have been working closely with our structures, including with law enforcement agencies, to be able to expose those that do this kind of activities that tend to undermine the good work that government is doing.
What has happened to those 14 councillors?
Well, part of those, from what we know, those are cases that some of them are under police investigations. We are expecting that the law must take its course. They've got to be seen acting with greater speed so that we inculcate a sense of responsibility from amongst those that we deploy to discharge various other duties on behalf of the communities that we're expected to serve.
Are those councillors still working?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily know on what is the specific status of individual councillors. What I know is that some of them, for instance, specific to a case in the Steve Tshwete municipality, where the councillor was specifically suspended by the council, I know that even in those instances where there were councillors of the ANC involved, we had encouraged those councils to take the necessary actions and make sure that up until the ensuing investigations are done, those councillors are at least put aside.
So would you then say that it would be proper for the 14 councillors that we've referred to be suspended?
I think in certain instances, some have been suspended already. It's just that, I would want to really speak with a great sense of authority, looking at all of the facts. But I know that action has been taken. Structures of the ANC are resolute. They are taking action where there are individuals accused of wrongdoing, and those individuals are being investigated by law enforcement agencies. Our structures take concurrent actions as well.
Do you know of any ANC member who has been expelled during this particular period over allegations of COVID-19 corruption?
Well, I can go and check that for you. I know of a specific case which I keep on referring to in Mpumalanga, where action has been taken, and that the Provincial Executive Committee, flowing from Rule 25 of the ANC Constitution, took the necessary actions to suspend the membership of such a councillor until such time that these cases are concluded.
But you don't know of an expulsion, yeah?
Well, when your membership is suspended, in a way, you are no longer part of the active life of the African National Congress.
But suspension and expulsion are two different things. But let me just quickly bring into this conversation Solly Malatjie, who's from the Democratic Alliance. Solly, just listening to how the governing party has responded to allegations of corruption against its members, are you satisfied with that?
Look, good evening, Aldrin, and to Bule on the line and all your viewers. It's totally insufficient. Because I think what is very important with this is that it was anticipated that there will be very rapid government expenditure, and that will also extend to municipalities who would embark on these large purchases of PPEs and other personal protective gear. So what we had proposed was that if there had been a chief inspectorate that was located specifically to look and oversee COVID expenditure, and also for the Treasury to use its capacity to oversee the expenditure that municipalities embark on in this process, because there is sufficient cases from the past of large-scale looting and unethical transactions taking place at local government level.
Are you speaking about cases before COVID-19?
Yeah, cases before COVID-19, which would have been a microscope that helps in trying to put measures in place to circumvent this instance. I mean, some of the transactions that have been doing the rounds even on social media and even verifiable in the form of the inflated prices of expenditure for PPEs is totally unacceptable, and something if municipalities were getting signed off from a central body in the form of the Treasury that is able to verify through the central database system that exists where all service providers that do business with government are registered, would have been easily be able to pick up some of the discrepancies in terms of pricing, but also to put preventive measures in place in there, because the political accountability is separate from what happens at the administrative level. Because yes, ultimately you have to hold the administrators accountable, and you also have to deal with the political influence that pressurizes the administrators into getting entangled into these unethical transactions.
Okay, so I'm going to hear when we come back from Pule Mabe from the ANC about this idea of having the chief directorate who will be able to oversee some of these tenders. We just have to quickly say goodbye to our SABC 3 viewers, but the conversation continues on the SABC News Channel 404. And welcome back. You're still watching Unfiltered with me, Aldrin Simpier. As you can see in the background, we've got the Democratic Alliance as well as the ANC being represented in this conversation that we're having about allegations of corruption that are currently unfolding. Pule, there's a suggestion coming from Soli in that the party is saying that let there be a chief directorate who will be able to oversee all these allegations of corruption as well as trying to mitigate the interference in the tender procurement.
Well, Aldrin, we have got sufficient mechanisms in institutions of state to be able to attend to instances of corruption. We have got the SIU, we have got the Hawks, we have got numerous other bodies which are charged with the responsibility of looking into these things.
But I think Soli's argument is based on a body that will be a deterrent, that you don't even have to go as far as the Hawks investigating. You avoid the corruption happening.
Before it happens,
before it happens,
Well, the fact that you have already established CSD, which is a central repository of entities that are doing business with government. One of the things that allows you to do is that should an institution or should an entity be found to be wanting, that is doing business with the state, there are various measures that could be undertaken immediately on the spot. One such a measure is to blacklist such an entity, including its directors, from continuing to do or transact with institutions of state. I think what we need to be doing is to make sure that we reinforce institutions that exist, that are charged with the responsibility of investigating malpractices or instances of corruption or acts that could ordinarily be seen to be undermining.
I'm going to get Soli to respond to you quickly. I'm going to get Soli to respond to you now. But just quickly, Pule, would you agree that all those measures have always been in place, but even then we're still facing these allegations of corruption now that you also have the SIU that has to intervene and investigate these tender corruption allegations?
Well, of course, those measures have been in place. What is required is to make sure that there is reinforcement, but also allow for government also to be proactive. Where there has been successful prosecution against those that were found to be in the wrong or for whatever commercial crimes that include tender rigging and all of that, such cases ought to be exposed so that an impression is not created that while we have these systems, we are not, or while we have these platforms, we are not seeing what is their response or intervention relates to dealing with instances of corruption. But if we can make it a culture to go out there and report when government has successfully prosecuted against someone or an entity found to have been in the wrong, or have expelled government officials who have done or suspected to have been involved in some of these malpractices, have tested through a process of institutions of state found to be in the wrong and ultimately expelled. When people see this kind of actions being undertaken, then there will be renewed confidence.
Yeah.
There will be renewed trust that mechanisms that government is putting forward are indeed working.
Soli, I see you shaking your head there.
Yeah, look, I mean, Pule is trying his best to downplay the severity of the situation here. The reality is that the government put in a dedicated fund for COVID, right? And it took the proactive steps. Those proactive steps were insufficient because they were not accompanied by putting in a body that will oversee the expenditure that is associated with COVID-19. Because let us be honest about the reality of public spending in South Africa. It is contaminated by theft. It is contaminated by inflated prices. I mean, we've had instances where, for instance, the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Social Development spent 22 million on just 48,000 blankets. I mean, we've had the OR Tambo District Municipality, wherein the speaker received an invoice of 4.8 million from an entity that did door-to-door. I mean, Aldrin, you and I can do door-to-door, man. It won't cost that much. So I think here the issue is not what you have put in place that has always existed. Because corruption, theft, looting have always existed in South Africa, despite all the great institutions that are in there. But if you had put in measures in place that are proactive, you'll be able to even track the expenditure of the money. I mean, you'll be able to verify, first instance, invoices that are submitted to say this invoice that is so handwritten, poorly written, just on a note of paper. I mean, not even pre-2000 love letters were written as badly as that invoice was. So we are not dealing with hypothetical issues here. I think there are two things that needs to happen, right? Is that where questionable documentation exists, if there were internal systems that are strong to pick up of those, they would have prevented a lot of this. Because ultimately now is that we know from the history of governance in this country and from the history of the ANC's incompetence in governance, that where there is large-scale spending, where it is immediate and where it is rapid, it is always accompanied by the opportunism that results in the theft of these state resources that are meant basically to uplift people's lives during a pandemic.
Tell me then, why do you think, Soli, it is so easy for people to steal from the coffers of the state when even when the president made the announcement of the 500 billion rand relief fund that is being made available, there was also the president again saying that we will act decisively against people who steal from the state. I'm yet to hear of a person who has been arrested, and I know that Pule Mabe said that there are investigations that are underway, but I'm yet to hear of a prosecution of somebody who is accused of having stolen money from the COVID-19 relief fund.
Yeah, look, I think the problem is much deeper, is that even though it happens at local government level or even at provincial local government level, the lack of political appetite to proceed, it's because it is associated with the political elite that are in power. So it's difficult for corrupt people to lay charges against each other and to follow through in terms of submitting the evidence that will lead to the prosecution of those. Because also there's been a historical legacy of nonchalance towards corruption. And it is only when it involves some low-ranked officials, when they are being used as scapegoats to salvage the careers of political bigwigs, that there will be so much strong political will to see that. But the reality is these unethical transactions and dealings are to the benefit of the political leaders, and it takes time to prove that. But ultimately, if there was the correct leadership, ethical leadership at all levels of governance and decision making, it will be able to prevent the looting. And sometimes, Aldrin, corruption thrives because someone turns a blind eye.
Yeah.
Sometimes it thrives because there are no consequences. Therefore, it creates a culture of perpetual repetition.
Okay, let's bring in the EFF's head of presidency. Sinawo Tambo is joining us on the line. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. Starting off with the march that your party led in the OR Tambo region, what was that about?
So it was basically, greetings to your viewers and to yourself, Aldrin. It was basically to campaign against the large-scale corruption that's happening in our Tambo region, as Soli has mentioned, with regards to millions that were allocated to run a door-to-door program with regards to the COVID-19 campaign. So what we are seeing, of course, the Eastern Cape is infamous for very large-scale levels of corruption, which are unjustifiable, which are ludicrous, and of course are also just carry a great character of audacity, because that's not the only type of corruption you see in the Eastern Cape. You saw, of course, with the scooters that were prescribed and given 10 million to be funded, which suddenly no one can actually tell us what is their mandate and what is their purpose. So the march in OR Tambo was, of course, centered around that specific issue, but of course also to attack and fight against the broader corruption that is happening in the Eastern Cape and decaying that province.
And the Eastern Cape being one of those provinces that have been heavily implicated in corruption allegations in relation to COVID-19 funds. And as you heard earlier on, Keza Khanyago also indicating that the Premier, Oscar Mabuyakulu, has written to the President to say that the SIU must investigate these allegations of corruption within the Eastern Cape province. So when we come back, we'll get some more reaction to the conversation that we do. And welcome back. You're still watching Unfiltered with me, Aldrin Simpier. Our focus this evening being on allegations of corruption and around the COVID-19 Relief Fund. And we're in conversation, as we've indicated, with the Democratic Alliance, the EFF, as well as the ANC. And we still have Sinawo on the line. Sinawo was speaking about the OR Tambo march that happened last week. And then later on, we also had the Executive Mayor, Thokozile Sokanyile, appearing before Parliament. What do you make of the arguments that she gave and also the absence of a municipal manager at the OR Tambo district?
I don't think there was anything substantive provided by the municipal manager because, I mean, the municipal manager is presiding over a regime that is handwriting invoices for COVID-19 water supplies and sanitation programs, yet no work is being seen to be done in that province. The Eastern Cape has one of the highest number of schools which are closing as a result of not having water, not having proper toilets, not having proper sanitation. And of course, it's spiraling out of control in terms of the COVID-19 cases and infections which are happening in that province in particular. So there's nothing substantive that we got from the municipal manager. And of course, that's because that person is directly implicated in large-scale and unsophisticated looting, because there's no sophistication from it. But I think the most worrying thing is that even though the Premier has appealed to the President to make an intervention into the corruption that's happening in the Eastern Cape, there's no mention from the President on that corruption, especially last night, which was basically something that he orchestrated like a family meeting to shout at us as citizens while he has abdicated his responsibility as the leader of the state. He doesn't make any pronouncements on corruption. He doesn't provide any updates on how these funds that have been looted and lost are going to be recouped and, of course, channeled in the right direction. So we don't see any consequences coming from the executive of the country with regards to corruption. The Minister of Health, William Kize, was seen endorsing those scooters, which are dehumanizing and, of course, inefficient by any scale. He was seen initially endorsing that program, and he has come out last week to say that the mandate of those scooters is not actually to be ambulances, but to distribute medical resources. But they're inadequate for that purpose as well. So we don't see an executive that has an appetite to handle corruption. And that's something that's very concerning.
Well, a political party that's quite significant in the Eastern Cape is the UDM. Let's just quickly listen to what the leader of the UDM, Bantu Holomisa, had to say about allegations of corruption. Or rather, I understand it's in Nkwankwa.
Up until we as members of parliament are on the ground, up until people living at provincial parliament level are on the ground, the level of accountability will always be weak and ineffective. And for these reasons, we're saying that even the turnaround package of the government can never be effectively overseen by Parliament if we don't play our effective role. So this thing needs us to go back to the drawing board. There's various stakeholders to look at how it can be done effectively and how the level of corruption can be combated, how the resources can be deployed effectively in order to help the poor and the needy in South Africa.
Okay, well, there you had it from Ngaboyum Zukwangwa. Let's go to the ANC's Bule Mabe. Just listening into what Sinawo had to say earlier on, Ngaboyum Zukwangwa had to say as well. And this issue that has been coming up over and over again, and some people argue that is the president really committed to fighting corruption, considering, for instance, that you have advocate Shamila Batoy saying that the Hawks don't have the sophisticated skills to investigate sophisticated corruption. And then on the other end, you have the Public Protector's Office that are saying that Treasury has asked them to cut their budget by 17%.
Well, Aldrin, there is a commitment to fight and unearth instances of corruption. What is important is that all of these institutions of state that are charged with doing the work of investigating or pronouncing on those that are accused or carry allegations of doing things that give government a bad name, they should also themselves do a skills audit. Make sure that they bring well within those institutions men and women of integrity who have got the necessary skills and capacity to be able to fast-track this investigation so that they do not take time. Because what tends to sometimes undermine the good work that government is doing is when these investigations are prolonged and people don't tend to see an end on those. When they don't see an end on those, they end up not having the necessary faith that the interventions being undertaken by government are sufficient to address some of these malpractices.
But it's the very same government that is telling the Public Protector, for instance, that it can't afford the Office of the Public Protector's current budget. It must be cut by 17%. And at the same time, the same Public Protector's Office can't fill 33 vacancies. That doesn't really say that the state is committed, doesn't it? Isn't it?
Well, that's a bit of a worry. Aldrin, you'll also accept that not just with law enforcement agencies or Chapter 9 institutions, across institutions of government, and by the way, across, and this we have all observed, I mean, we don't speak for government, but we have observed this, across government there has been a big cut of budgets. A larger part of resources have been redirected to deal with our health settings. You now have got to build field hospitals, which were never in the plan. You now have got to provide some income grants to the unemployed. You have had to deal with the issue of food security as well, because we are dealing with a situation that we did not necessarily plan for. We didn't know that right in the middle of 2020, we will be dealing with a pandemic of this kind of proportions. What we now need to do, and which is what the Minister of Finance had spoken about, to now start to do what is called zero-based budgeting, to make sure that our budget is need-based according to what we will need for that year. Because we can't even begin to imagine something called post-COVID, because we do not know. What we have now come to acclimatize to is the notion of COVID-19 conditions. Even when we marshal a plan on economic reform, is one that speaks to an economic reform plan that talks to an economy that has got to coexist with these COVID conditions. It also means that the same has got to be applied even on how you marshal your plan to fight corruption within a government setting.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, Bule, but Soli, let me hear your take on this. To be fair on the Office of the Public Protector, to be fair on the NDPP as well, these are problems that have been there pre-COVID.
You're absolutely correct, Aldrin. And I just wanted to deal with something that Bule had mentioned. The reality is that the underfunding the crime-fighting institutions in the country is not a direct result of COVID-19. While COVID-19 has resulted in some budgets across government being reduced, historically, these institutions have been underfunded. And it is primarily because they are underfunded, Bule, that they are unable to attract the best talents in terms of the investigators they need to build the capacity they need so that they can investigate instances of corruption, so that those investigations are not prolonged. Because when you've got sufficient capacity, you are able to produce results within a reasonable amount of time. And secondly, this notion of Opule indicating that field hospitals have been built and therefore they've taken money from state coffers. There's no field hospitals that have been built. The one field hospital that exists in the Eastern Cape was donated to by the private sector. Mpumalanga has no field hospital. The Northern Cape has no field hospital. Limpopo has no field hospital.
Isn't it referring to the hospitals, well, the hospitals that we are not used to? For instance, the ones in Nasrec that has been set up.
Yeah, that's what I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
There is no field hospital that has been built by government money in the Eastern Cape. But
here in Gauteng, we speak about Nasrec, for instance.
Yeah, and that's why I was giving those examples. And Nasrec, you look that the capacity of Nasrec is also to be a quarantine facility. Yeah. Because with a field hospital, you also need the medical equipment, the size of the beds. You need the oxygen cylinders to be there so that you can accommodate patients. You need the ventilators to be there.
That's what the Minister of Health said that they will be implementing as well. But let me just quickly go to Sinao. Sinao, just your take quickly around the capacity of the state investigating institutions.
I think I agree with Sodi. I mean, these institutions are deliberately underfunded. We saw it when initially the Scorpions were collapsed, that the ruling party doesn't want there to be existing legal institutions that can take them to task, efficiently so. And of course, when you collapse these institutions and you underfund them, they don't have the capacity to pay the required wages for the necessary people who can conduct quality investigations. Hence, when Patoki says that there isn't enough sophistication within the Hawks to conduct investigations, that is a deliberate occurrence, it's a deliberate creation of those who are corrupt, do not want to be held accountable, and of course want to turn state institutions and Chapter 9 institutions into the same toothless integrity commissions that exist within their political parties.
As an opposition party, do you guys bear some of the responsibility as well that you failed in your oversight?
Well, the EFF has been conducting its oversight. We've been sending countless letters, but the problem that exists within the government that are of today is that they don't respond to measures of accountability, whether it be letters from opposition parties. Ministers ignore them deliberately. Countless times we've written to the Minister of Public Enterprises with regards to what's happening at Eskom and the corruption of the CEO there. We've written to the councils in the Eastern Cape with regards to the doctored invoices and, of course, the fraudulent and dehumanizing scooter programs that were occurring in that process as well. And at some point, we're going to be left with no option but, of course, to go to the ground and, of course, agitate in the only manners that we know how. Because, of course, our approach...
What does it mean? What does it mean?
We are going to have to take some form of political action in order to hold government accountable.
What type of political action?
What we are dealing with is that the conditions created by COVID-19.
Sorry, what type of political action? Sorry, so now we're running out of time.
Of course, for example, if we speak about Eskom as a mere example, we are expecting ourselves to conduct a sit-in at the Eskom offices if the CEO is not removed. In the Eastern Cape, we're going to deal with those scooters in the manner that we see fit if they were not removed. And of course, they were rolled out.
But what does it mean, Sinao? What does it mean? Political action, the manner that you see fit, what does it mean?
It means we're going to conduct protest action to hold government accountable. Because
during COVID-19?
Accountable measures. What else can we be subjected to? They are corrupt during COVID-19.
Are you going to be doing this after COVID-19?
They are undermining state institutions during COVID-19. They're not accounting to proper accountability measures during COVID-19. And that is basically a pandemic being taken advantage of. So how else do we respond as an opposition?
So are you going to ask your members to be protesting during a health crisis?
We'll deliberate amongst ourselves, but the health crisis is not being averted or alleviated by any measures of government.
Okay. Solly, just quickly, your response to how the opposition has conducted its oversight?
Well, we've been very responsible and proactive in conducting our oversight. I mean, oversight, exists in making sure that, whoever is in charge has to deliver. and we have been proactive in highlighting areas of deficiencies and even areas of possible improvement. And I mean, the example of the Eastern Cape, for instance, came through one of the oversight mechanisms, which is a parliamentary question from the DA, where we asked the Minister of Health to say, do these glorified wheelbarrows meet the requirements for operating as ambulances?
Yeah.
And he said not, which was a very startling revelation, because at the launch they were very glowing in terms of how they would be able to go into rural areas to transport patients and all of that. So the opposition has done its part, more so the Democratic Alliance.
Okay, from the Democratic Alliance side, can we get a commitment that there will be no more evictions during the COVID-19 period?
Look, I mean, there are two things here, Aldrin, without generalizing the issue here. The law as is, that has even been communicated by the Minister of Human Settlements with a meeting she had recently with the National Council of Provinces, is that there's understanding that there would be no evictions on pieces of land that had been occupied prior to the announcement of the lockdown, and that any additional new structures, because there are pieces of land that are earmarked, some for housing developments to benefit people who have been on the housing list for years. And there is what has been discovered by anyone who has followed the history of housing demand in the country, is that some communities often invade land for the purposes of stopping housing developments or being prioritized at the top of the list than those who have followed the letter of the law.
In a nutshell, where the DA governs and there's been illegal invasion of land, those people will be evicted. Yes, no?
The law indicates that where there are new structures, Aldrin, the law, which must be respected by everyone, whether it's a DA government or any other government, indicates that no additional structures should be built on unoccupied land as it was pronounced prior to the lockdown.
And you will be evicting them?
The law must take its course.
Okay, thank you so much, Soli Malati. We also appreciate the EFF as well as the ANC for this conversation. And earlier on, we had the spokesperson of the SIU, Keza Khanyago. We've come to the end of today's program. Thank you so much for all your contributions. Goodbye. See you again next week, same time, same place.